Bonjour tout le monde, good morning. Je suis extrêmement heureux de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour cet événement spécial du Centre de recherche en droit, technologie et société de l'Université d'Ottawa et de la revue Droit d'Ottawa. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be welcoming you all today for our virtual event celebrating our friend, colleague and mentor, Ian Kerr. For those who don't know me, my name is Florian Martin Barito. I am an associate professor and the University Research Chair in Technology and Society at the University of Ottawa, where I am the director of the University's Center for Law, Technology and Society, Canada's leading research hub on technology law, ethics, and policy that was co-founded by Ian. I would have obviously preferred to welcome you all on campus for this event. As most of you know, we had terrific plans for April 2020 hosting ReRobot at Ottawa and celebrating Ian. Sadly, we had to cancel everything because of the pandemic. We organized some elements virtually, like ReRobot last September, and we're keeping others for the brighter days when we will be able to. But there is one thing that we could no longer keep to ourselves. And thankfully, this end of March, we have found two opportunities to celebrate Ian and unveil this surprise. The first one, and the one who conveyed us today, Ottawa Law Review published The Death of the AI Author, Ian's last piece that he co-authored with our friend Carys J. We wanted to have a conversation around this important piece, but how could we start a conversation about robots, law, and arts without some art about robots and law and love? That's not something we could do, right? And so, as many of you, Ian loved Eric Joyner's portraits of robots and their donuts. They illustrated his website, the collection on robots law, that he co-edited with Michael Fromkin and Ryan Kello, and also the ReRobot North Edition. So we asked Eric Joyner to bring Ian's memory to canvas. Ian was an explorer, a pioneer, a trailblazer, a dreamer, a mentor, a friend who further unlocked our universe. He dreamed he learned to steer by the stars and taught us with music, donuts, pizza, and robots to do so. Today, I'm delighted to present to you Endless Knowledge, an original piece by Eric Joyner, commissioned by Ian's family and his friends at the University of Ottawa Center for Law, Technology and Society to celebrate the musician, the friend to dogs, the finisher of donuts, and the philosopher of robots. You will find the painting on the center's website, and a direct link has been posted in the chat. For those who are not familiar with Ian, the painting is accompanied by a beautiful write-up that was led by two of his students, Katie Zislagi and Megan Sally, with quotes from notably Rush. Évidemment, ce texte est également disponible en français, non seulement parce que nous sommes à l'Université d'Ottawa et au Canada, mais aussi comme il en a si bien fait la preuve à ReRobot 2018 à Stanford, Ian aimait beaucoup aussi se présenter dans la langue de Molière. And so today we unveiling in that artwork in a virtual fashion. It will be displayed on campus at the center, and when that pandemic will be over, we will invite you all to come see it in person as part of a major event on AI and society once we're able to do so. And that painting would have been also maybe the perfect cover for something else that happened in March, a book that Ian's friends just published, Artificial Intelligence and the Law in Canada. He started the conversation more than like 20 years ago, way before it became the buzzword that unlocked so many doors, today. It helped us, it unlocked those doors for us. And in the pandemic, colleagues across the country came together for this first peer-reviewed collection on the state and Future of Law and AI in Canada. Beyond some authors' moving notes, the book itself is dedicated to Ian, and if one still wondered how Ian imprinted his joyful and curious spirit on the people he met, I would invite you to read the beautiful tribute written by Justice Rosalia Bella of the Supreme Court of Canada that opens the collection. And the first chapter in this collection is actually authored by Carys J, and it's on AI and copyright law, and it's kind of a follow-up to the piece we will discuss with you today. And on those words, I will stop speaking here to leave the floor to Carys and our panelists, who will shortly be introduced by Matthew Zaya, the editor-in-chief of the Ottawa Law Review. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, Professor. So good morning, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us today, not only to celebrate the publication of an important piece of legal scholarship, but also to celebrate the legacy of our dearest friend, colleague, mentor, and professor, Ian Kerr. So on behalf of the senior board and the editors-in-chief at the Ottawa Law Review, as well as our faculty advisors, Jan Campagnolo and Kyle Kirkup, it is an absolute honor that Ian's final piece was published in volume 52 of the Ottawa Law Review. As the topic of today's discussion, the death of the AI author was written by two leaders and pillars in academia, Carys J. Craig and Ian Kerr. I should add that the paper and all articles at the Ottawa Law Review are open access, as I know Ian was a big fan of open access scholarship. And to that end, it is my pleasure to now introduce our esteemed speakers for this afternoon. So first, we have James Grimmelman, who is the Tesler Family Professor of Digital and Information Law at Cornell Tech and Cornell Law School. He is a leading expert in intellectual property, computer, and internet law. Second, Carys J. Craig is an associate professor at Osgoode Hall Law School, York University, where she is the academic director of the professional LLM program in intellectual property law. And she's also the editor-in-chief of the Osgoode Hall Law Journal and is co-author of the subject matter for today. And last but not least, we have Michael Geist. Professor Geist is the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa, where he is a full professor at the Faculty of Law, Common Law section, and a faculty member of the Center for Law, Technology, and Society that he co-founded with Professor Kerr. And before beginning the discussion, I will also invite our guests this afternoon to use the chat function to direct any of the questions you have to our speakers. We will then ask the speakers to address the questions following the discussion, most likely. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to Professor Grimmelman to begin our discussion.
Thank you. It is an honor to be here today to share this tribute to Ian. And I'm going to proceed by presenting a bit on the context and the significance of the death of the AI author. And it's an article that responds to what Anne-Marie Brighty memorably called a bad penny of a question, one that keeps coming up over and over again, which is, can a computer be an author? This has been a subject that has been written about for decades in copyright scholarship. And that question gets crossed frequently with another question, more fundamental in some ways, which is, can a computer be a person? Because there seems to be this equation that authors are people, and therefore to be an author, a computer would have to be a person, regardless of how creative its outputs are or seem to be. So I want to just give a quick tour of these two questions, very impressionistic, stopping at a few significant points along the way, and then circle back to the really, really interesting intervention that Carys and Ian have made. So our story starts by asking why it is that copyright cares about computers. And there's a thing very interesting, which is that lots of copying done by computers for many purposes doesn't count. This is a book scanning machine, and there's case law in multiple countries that if you just scan a book and feed it to a computer for the computer to analyze its text and don't show any of the contents to a person, it doesn't count. In the United States, there are multiple cases finding this is fair use. And so there's a sense that computer reading doesn't count. But on the other hand, too, there's this anxiety around creativity made using computers, that we don't raise the question, does the spirograph own a copyright in the tracing you make using it? And yet it seems we feel compelled to keep asking that question again and again. Should the computer, should the algorithm, should the artificial intelligence own a copyright or be considered the author of a work produced using it? Now, the orthodox view in American copyright law, at least, is the answer given by Justice Holmes in an opinion called Weistein over 100 years ago, which is that the copy, by which he meant the original, the work itself, is the personal reaction of an individual upon nature. Personality always contains something unique. It expresses its singularity even in handwriting, and a very modest grade of art has in it something irreducible, which is one man's alone. That something he may copyright, unless there is a restriction in the words of the act. And this is a view of romantic authorship. The idea that creativity, the kind of creativity that copyright cares about, is an expression of the ineffable personality of a person. That inner essence is somehow transmutes ideas from some other plane of existence into the works, the expression that we see in our world. And it is that harnessing of individual, inimicable, ineffable creativity that is authorship and that deserves copyrights. So if that's the view that you have, that there is something creatively sparked inside of a person, then it seems almost inevitable that no, of course, a computer or anything that is not a person or a human could be an author. But a really forceful perspective in the opposite direction, not specifically about copyright, was given by this man, Alan M. Turing. In his article, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, he posed what he called the imitation game, which has since been named the Turing test in his honor. He asked us to imagine an interrogator, questioner, asking questions of someone or something that they can interact with only by typing and receiving typed replies. And it might be a human, it might be a computer, and you would type questions to it, and it would return with replies. And on this basis, you have to guess whether it's a human or a computer. And a computer that was successful in fooling human judges might therefore be judged to be intelligent. And this is a purely functional test. It has no truck with what's inside the box or behind the door. It only asks, is the output, is the work itself it produces indistinguishable from what a person might do? And so this discards the question of whether the computer counts philosophically as a person or not. It simply asks us to look at the work itself, to ask, is this thing on paper worthy of a copyright? Is it the sort of thing we should reward with copyright protection? Is it creative and original? And discard entirely what produced it. And very interestingly, one of the questions in his sample transcript of a possible dialogue is about creativity and poetry. He asks, please write me a sonnet on the subject of the fourth bridge, and to which the hypothetical computer or human respondent responds, count me out on this one. I could never write poetry. There's a suggestion here that writing poetry is in fact hard, something that is so difficult to achieve that being able to do it would be a hallmark of humanity. So Turing takes a very functional view. And the counter argument is most strongly put, I think, by this guy, the disgraced former professor of philosophy, John Searle, in his Chinese room argument. He asks us to imagine a person working in a room with volumes about how to translate into Chinese, following a purely functional set of rules about how to respond to questions written in Chinese that come into the room. This person is in fact carrying out a Turing test, but they have no knowledge of it. This person has no knowledge of the language, no comprehension of the questions. they're just making marks on paper. He asks us to imagine this as the analog of the computer, and therefore there is a consciousness missing behind the functionality, and therefore something essential, the essential spark that Justice Holmes is looking for in creativity is missing. Another, and I think more persuasive, pragmatic reply comes from Pamela Samuelson, who has written one of the earliest and still most influential articles on computer-generated works and copyright, in which she makes the quite logical point in response to suggestions that we might recognize computer copyright, that we don't need to answer the question, and in fact, we shouldn't. That the purpose of copyright is to incentivize creativity, to provide a supply of works for the public, and that from that innovation-centered perspective, based thinking about the incentives and the goals of a utilitarian supply of works for the public, we don't need computer copyright because the computer can't be incentivized. It cannot respond to the economic rewards of copyright the way that an author would, and therefore nothing is served by trying to assign copyright to the machine. This perspective sidesteps the Turing-Searle debate in that it doesn't care what's inside the machine. It is in fact irrelevant to the question we want to answer. In a deeper sense, it's also aligned with Turing and very much against Holmes and Searle in that she's endorsing a view on what we care about the work itself, that we are interested in what it produces. This is an older argument, but more recently, Anne-Marie Brighty kicked off a refreshed interest in this question of AI authorship and AI-assisted authorship with an article in which she surveyed some of the creativity that we've seen from creators who created in part using computers, and really anticipated the wave of computer generation apps today. Things like AI Portrait, where you can take a selfie of yourself and it will generate what looks like a 19th century oil painting of you. Her solution was to say, well, we again still know that the algorithm and AI are not authors, but we should act as though they are for purposes of the copyright system for the limited, purely fictional purpose of letting somebody else claim copyright, much like we treat employers in American law as the fictive authors of works made for hire by their employees. We should treat the people who use and deploy programs as the fictional authors of works created by the programs they use, again, because it solves Samuelson-style goals of copyright law. So this is, I'd say, the ruling discourse here embraces the idea of authorship, but then still assigns it to people and sidesteps the question of whether computers can be authors or computers can be people by saying, let's focus on the pragmatic reasons for giving or denying copyright. So let's set up against that the death of the AI author, which comes out of a gloriously different tradition in thinking about creativity and in thinking about copyright. Particularly, it's grounded in literary theory, particularly the idea of the death of the author alluded to in the title. And they retrace literary theory debates over what the role of the author is, because until the 1960s, dominant literary theories tended to focus on a romantic author, some singular figure with an individual creative vision and an intent to communicate by means of a work that is then embodied in the work itself, and therefore the work is the transmission of a particular author's intention, and the meaning of the work is the one they assign to it. And so in literary theory, the wave of criticism that focuses on the context in which a work is written, or the readings offered by multiple people who encounter it, or the way in which its meaning evolves over time as successive waves of interpreters experience it, that focus on the reader generation and co-generation of meanings undercuts the role of the romantic author as the one who fixes a work and fixes its meaning. Well, carry that over to the copyright realm, and you might ask, what does it do to ask whether a computer is an author? So on one level, they point out, to ask whether a computer can be a romantic author is to ask a question that it is destined to fail. If we are looking to the computer to provide that anchoring by which some ineffable, intangible, and inexpressible creative vision is made concrete, then we are going to have a very hard time searching for that in the computer. And the reason that it fails, however, is not because there's something uniquely disabled about algorithms of AI. It fails because there aren't romantic authors in the first place. And so setting it up as this source of romantic authorship is simply asking it to restore to copyright something that was never really there in copyright. The romantic author has been a fiction all along, and that people are just trying to prop up that fiction by using it to analyze computer authorship. What matters instead is the capacity to participate in the social relations around a work and around creativity, to be part of those conversations, to generate the meanings that readers experience, to participate in the social and cultural and economic relations around it. And that play, that interplay, is something that AI is not going to provide for us. So I want to take this, however, one step further. I want to take this into the realm of science fiction. And I don't want to emphasize this is science fiction for now, but I think it is not impossible in principle. Take us back to Turing, where we started. The point of the Turing test is that an AI that passes the imitation game can participate in these relationships. That is, the AI that can write us a sonnet on the subject of the fourth bridge in response to a query about it is also capable of following up and engaging in a dialogue about it. To respond, why did you choose this word rather than another? Should I compare you to a summer's day or to a winter's day? But it wouldn't scan as well. That dialogue is part of the construction of the societal and cultural meanings of a work. And so current creative AIs fall apart as soon as the work is complete. They can't have meaningful conversations about it. They isolate the work, it stands alone, but they don't participate in that dialogue that follows. But we could imagine a more general artificial intelligence, one that truly does pass the Turing test, one that is more capable of having a set of conversations about a wide range of subjects. At which point, Turing would ask, why don't we treat this the same way we would treat a person for purposes of authorship? Or let's go to Samuelson and ask, well, this computer, they can have a conversation on a wide range of subjects about this. Maybe that could be incentivized by economic ownership. If you take seriously the views of AI theorists and transhumanists who think that an AI that was sufficiently intelligent could run away and start consuming resources in society to maximize its objectives, whatever they were, even if we're building an indefinitely large number of paper clips, well, that AI could be incentivizable. Things that help it make more paper clips certainly encourage it to do one thing. Things that deter that goal push another direction. Maybe AIs could be subject to economic incentives. Again, that functional perspective. If we could treat them as whether they were people, would it matter what was inside? And if it held forth in a dialogue about what it intended by the work, and if it shrugged its virtual shoulders at us when offered up a surprising meaning and said, I hadn't anticipated that, but I suppose in a sense you're right, and then came up with a witty rejoinder, or saw collaged works in ways that we didn't understand, it gets much harder to say that this really isn't a person. That's the danger of staking your question, can a computer be an author, on the question of, can a computer be a person? Because as Carys and Ian suggest, I think the more interesting thing from copyright's perspective is not can a computer be a person, but can a person be an author in the first place? Thank you.
Thank you, Florian, and thank you, James, for that. I also just want to give a big thanks to Mathieu and to everybody at the Ottawa Law Review team. It has been such a pleasure to, first of all, I mean, to work on this piece, to work on the drafting and the redrafting, and to work with the editorial team at Ottawa Law Review to try to bring us to this point. And so I really can't overemphasize how grateful I am for the work that has been done and for the sort of welcome home that the journal has given to this article. And you know, it really has been a labor of love. And one of the wonderful things about working with this team is that they heard Ian's voice in the article. And so even those little things that were sort of jokes that were put in when this was in its initial drafting stage were allowed to survive the editing process and remain in the final draft, so that I like to think that Ian's voice comes through loud and clear in this work. And for me, it's really just a privilege to be able to be here with you all and to be talking about this piece and to be having a conversation that I know Ian would just have loved to have been a part of. So I don't want to get into the meat of things without just first paying a tribute to Ian. First, obviously, as an amazing and a visionary scholar and someone who was just wonderful to work with, but also just as a terrific friend and as a terrific colleague and someone who really was able to inspire the people around him with his wisdom and with his knowledge and with his joy for this subject. So the piece itself, it began its life really as a series of conversations between Ian and I in conference settings where we were invited to talk about this sort of hot topic of AI in one respect or another. And Ian was trying to persuade me that there was something interesting to be said about AI and copyright, or AI and authorship. And going in, I was kind of the view that after we'd heard from Pam Samuelson and Anne-Marie Bridie and James Grimmelman here, that really there was not much else to be said about this topic. So that was my starting point. But Ian as well loved his folks at We Robot, was determined that I should really get to know all of these wonderful people he was working with in the artificial intelligence field. And so he was very persuasive that at some point we should co-author something about this. So this is the Ian encouragement that people often refer to, that kind of encouragement to think about and pursue ideas sometimes outside of our own comfort zone. And that's what this was for me. The catalyzing conversation really came when we were at a conference and we were listening to people grapple with this question of whether, not even whether AI could be an author, but honestly just the question of whether AI could own copyright. And everyone seemed to kind of agree that the options were either that the AI itself, or maybe the programmer, or maybe the user should be the first owner of copyright. And the question seemed to be framed in utilitarian terms. So maybe answering Pam Samuelson's question, like, is there a need for an incentive, and concluding that yes, there is. Sometimes it got stuck in what seemed like a sort of deontological muddle, where people were talking about natural rights of authorship and labor and investment, and then that was sort of transposed seamlessly to robots and AI, sometimes passing through Naruto the monkey on the way, but usually arriving at the conclusion that there was some desert or some sort of entitlement or matter of justice at stake when it comes to ownership of these works. And then the conversation seemed to just be skirting over those sort of larger normative questions and getting stuck in the weeds of doctrinal questions and trying to resolve them. So can the work of AI authorship be original? Can it be creative? If it is, who should be considered the author? Could we statutorily designate an author? And so anyone who sat next to Ian at a conference knows that he was a scribbler, right? He would like to sit and scribble notes to the person next to him. And so we were sort of engaged in scribbling notes to one another about what we thought of this. And I think we got to the point where we were like, well, of course the law could treat this like a work of authorship if it wanted to. Of course we could create rights in these computer-generated works for copyright purposes. And let's face it, if they're economically valuable, then that's probably what's going to happen, right? So we got past this doctrinal question. I was insisting there's nothing really interesting here. But we also kept hearing the suggestion that the people who were resisting the idea of AIs as authors were doing so because they were being romantic about what authorship was. This sort of humanism was conflated with romanticism, and the idea that authors must be human was kind of an anachronism, right? And so it was when we started talking about that I was scribbling frantically to Ian, no, it's not romantic to think that they must be human, it's the opposite, right? The romantic author is not a human author, it ignores what human authorship is. And Ian had scribbled back that they were also being really romantic about robots, right? That the idea of sort of humanizing, anthropomorphizing robots, but also romanticizing robots and forgetting about all of the sort of human effort that's involved in creating and operationalizing AI was also present in the same conversation. And so that was kind of how we decided in the end. He persuaded me, okay, we need to write a paper about unromantic authors and unromantic robots, or de-romanticize authors. So this was what we were trying to do when we started batting around these ideas. The other thing that he made clear was that this was not, in his eyes, a copyright paper. It wasn't really a copyright question, right? That the point was not to be able to answer whether there should be copyright in computer-generated works, but that the question we were tackling was way upstream of that, like whether the AI could be an author. And that question about authorship is a question about expressive agency. It's a question about the way we use legal fictions to extend law into the field of artificial intelligence. And it involves larger sort of philosophical questions about ontology and relationality and intentionality. And so all of this means there's something more at play than just thinking about authorship as the origin of copyright entitlement and the creation of these rights. The other thing, and I think this is responsive to some of what James was saying, especially towards the end there, about anticipating the future of AI and its potential development towards something that looks more dialogic, more like expressive agency than anything we currently have, was that if we take seriously the idea that this question is not about it's not about just what authors do, but it's about what must an author be? What is the ontology of authorship? Then really the answer to that shouldn't depend upon the state of art of technology. It shouldn't depend upon how developed technology is. It's actually a question about the nature of the thing, right? So I thought I would read this for you, because when we were initially working on the abstract, Ian wrote a short story as the entrance point for our thinking on it. He called it That Thou Art Mindful. And it's based or drawn on or inspired by Asimov's That Thou Art Mindful of Him. So it's something that's not actually in the final draft of the paper, so that you wouldn't otherwise have an opportunity to read it. But I think in some ways it shows how Ian sort of set up the philosophical inquiry behind the paper, and also it just lets you get a sense of his sort of taste for words and for writing. So I'll read that for you now. He says, George 10 sits alone, turning every bit of its bronobite brain inwards with all the markings of genius. George 10 identifies a vast array of complex and emerging patterns in an algorithmic universe of letters, numbers, words, symbols, and functions, providing innumerable proxies for actions and interactions, personalities and profiles, emotions, sequences, and structures, patterns no human could fully apprehend, appreciate, dream, sense, or feel. George X's powerful neural networks use machine learning to promulgate mobile armies of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms. Simulations of human relations enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, until finally they seem firm, canonical, almost obligatory. The stunning beauty in George X's assemblage of creations, profound in meaning and elegant in expression, eclipses its human counterparts, leaving little trace of imperfection. Laboring in magnificent, silent isolation, George X generates 1 million drafts each minute. In milliseconds, assigning criticism and correction iteratively, relentlessly rectifying its prose until every word is necessary. George X inexhaustibly collects and depicts human types and characters, with sensors and processors alert to every potential effect on an audience. It exerts from the various sciences everything that has artistic effect. Gorged on data, but with no taste for meaning, George X cannot converse because it has no semantic understanding. It is neither sentient nor social. It demonstrates no will or wisdom. And yet George X's emergent creativity churns out poignant works destined to become a cultural treasure, provoking the following question: what must an author be? Okay. So that's where we started, and by the time we'd written the paper, Ian said, I don't think we need that part anymore. So we just cut it out. But I thought you might appreciate hearing it, because I think it does show that even although he was resistant to the idea of just speculating about some imagined future, he also liked to begin by imagining that future, by imagining what is now only fiction, and using it to test what it was that we were trying to do, right? So by setting it up, I think it's fair to say, and I don't know if, I mean, we'll talk more about it in response to James, but I think the answer is going to still be that ontologically, it would, the lessons or the arguments that are made in this paper would hold, even when the artificial intelligence is engaging in this conversation in what is externally a convincing way, because ultimately this is a question of ontology and the ontology of authorship. Now, I think there's a footnote there where he concedes if we get to the point where maybe the AI is in fact ontologically indistinguishable from human, then we have much bigger problems on our hands than what is an author and who owns copyright. And that is a footnote that cites to James Grimmelman here for that point. So with that as our starting point, and as we batted around what the arguments might be, one of the things that Ian was great at was the sort of lateral thinking across different fields and connecting ideas, whether you had seen the connections or not, right? And so when I explained sort of where my frustrations were with the conversation about AI and copyright, he very quickly said, okay, so if I have you right, you're saying we're misunderstanding the relevance of the romantic author critique. We're sort of underestimating its importance, its ongoing importance in this context. We are misunderstanding the implications of the death of the author. We think it means that authorship doesn't matter, that only the text or the product matters, and that's not the lesson to be learned from the literary theory. And also, we've taken comfort in this false dichotomy where we think that if we sort of slide over to utilitarianism, then we've escaped romanticism and the romantic author is no longer at play. Are those the three things you're saying? Okay, yeah, when you put it that way, that sounds right. And so building on that, then, he looked at the way that we were describing what it was that emergent creativity was doing, that generative AI was doing, and made those connections to show that it was actually this myth of the romantic author that was allowing us to misunderstand the generative AI as an author, that we were imagining the sort of human-computer interaction as being now a new place to tell the false narrative about what it is that the authors are, that machines are doing, the authors do when they create. And so he pointed to the way in which artificial intelligence pulls on vast quantities of human created data, the way that it is fundamentally embedded and dependent upon human created texts, codes, processes, dialogues, exchanges, relationships, and contexts. And then we, as we conceptualize what the AI does, imagine it as radically isolated, independent, and creative, and therefore severed from all of those sort of underlying inputs in what it ultimately produces. And so this idea of sort of ridding the AI of its social context and of its interdependency is very much what we do when we imagine authorship as an individual enterprise, when we imagine the author as the sort of romantic ideal, rather than the much sort of messier reality of authorship as creativity in context, as discursive, dialogic, and necessarily dependent upon those around us. There was another funny thing I thought I'd mention before I finish, which was, so I wrote the way we worked on this was we sort of divided up the different pieces and we each wrote it and then we swapped over and swapped them back again. And there was one point where I had passed to Ian my a piece on romantic authorship and the scholarship of the sort of 1990s in the copyright field and romantic authorship. And he passed something back to me, and his note in the email said, "I feel like I have to warn you. I'm writing about David Hasselhoff and talking about him talking crazily about actors being programmed and other strange things. It might be kind of hard to match your substance and tone here." Right? To which I responded, "Yeah, I just haven't got to my David Hasselhoff bit yet, but I'm assuming every paper should have one." So certainly it was Ian's ability to sort of bring together these stories and these ideas about what the world might be with sort of popular culture, and then, you know, real deep philosophical theorizing about the nature of law and legal fictions and human relationships that produced, I think, such a rich body of scholarship from Ian, and something that I was just fortunate and delighted to be able to contribute to with this paper. So I think I'm at about 15 minutes. I'll stop talking now and pass things along to Michael.
Well, thanks for that, and thanks for that, Carys. That was awesome. I think getting to hear the background and the interaction, I think for many will bring back sort of a flood of memories about what it was like to work with Ian in that way, and so that was wonderful. For me, it's a great honor to get the chance to participate in this panel and to reflect a little bit again on Ian's legacy, this time in the context of this really amazing paper. It's been a bit more than a year and a half since Ian passed, and obviously in the interim, there's been this just unimaginable year. We were talking before we began that even this semester feels like it's been several years in length, even though it's only been about 3 months. I'm sure, like many of you, I think about Ian often, his wisdom, his friendship, his knack for staying connected and for bringing people together. I think it's the very things that we've needed during this difficult time, and judging by the turnout today, it's something that he is still able to do. I know that for me, this still feels fresh. I can tell you, actually, just literally last week, I was contacted by a Brazilian professor who visited us as a graduate student about 15 years ago, and we were talking about a few things, and she asked for Ian's contact information. She wasn't aware of what had happened. And I told her the news, and obviously it was difficult and upsetting for her, but out came the stories about how Ian had influenced her career, and even more, had really influenced her life. Now, I could, of course, talk about Ian for a very long period of time. I'm really pleased to get to do this in the context of this paper. As you'll know, this brings together really two incredible rock stars in the Canadian academic universe. And I think, like so many of the collaborative papers that Ian was involved with, it plays so nicely to each of their respective strengths, both Carys and Ian's strengths. It's one of those papers that reveals new insights each time you read it. It was nice to get to reread it again as I prepared for this, and especially the copyright analysis and the efforts to grapple with authorship, whether AI or human, are of course at the heart of what some of the things Carys has been writing and thinking about for so many years. I think for Ian, the article is really a perfect crystallization of so much of what made Ian, and I thought I would just highlight a few. First, it is, like so many of his works, a collaborative effort. I think I mentioned this when Ian passed, but one of the things that stands out the most when you review his remarkable scholarly legacy is how important collaboration was to him. The list of co-authors is almost as long as his list of works. He just enjoyed bringing out the best in others and working with colleagues that would in turn bring out, I think, the best in him. He worked with senior scholars and junior scholars and grad students and JD students and legal professionals and technology experts. There really were no limits. Ian's universe was filled with smart, fun people, and I think he knew that together they could often be more than the sum of their parts and have a great time in the journey as they would engage in that scholarship. You may have seen that the paper itself is dedicated to Ian's students. And again, there's really no more fitting tribute. His dedication to his students was truly unparalleled. But more than that, it was the connections that he made and really sustained with students that lives on. And I was scrolling through the attendees today, and the names that I saw, some of the people who worked with Ian really long time ago that are now well established in their careers. But yet it's very clear that the influence, the impact that Ian had lives on really strongly. Some of the students I know that worked on this paper, Megan, Sally, and Felice Young in particular, are people who have worked with me, and they are, again, just, it's amazing the kinds of people that were attracted to work with Ian and to work with Carys. I also have to say that I love that this paper is published in the Ottawa Law Review. Ian's dedication and commitment to the University of Ottawa over a couple of decades was exceptional. I think, again, some of you may know this, but his last time, I believe his last time on campus, was spent at an event with Scotiabank as we worked to convince the bank that the University of Ottawa was the best place to invest in support of AI, law, ethics, and policy. A few of the people on the call were at that event, and we were in a smallish classroom. It's memorable for a number of reasons, certainly, and part of it was that Ian didn't even have the strength at that time to stand for his talk. He did when he agreed to do it, but he had taken a bit of a turn, and so he remained seated for what was really the keynote of that entire day. And it was, I know, exceptionally hard and really required just an enormous amount of strength to do it. But he was, as always, captivating and convincing and prescient, because many of the same issues that he talked about on that day are the issues that are found in this paper. And I must say that I am convinced, and I simply know it's true, that it was his talk, his passion, frankly, his willingness to plainly tell the representatives from the bank that this was his own personal health situation, but that he believed so strongly in the mission of the university, in the mission of the area and this field, that ultimately led to the Scotiabank AI and Society initiative that over the last year and a half or so has been fantastic from a production perspective and from ability to bring people together, and a really an amazing initiative at our university. As I mentioned, his talk that day really does bring to mind this paper. Ian had much to teach, but at the heart of much of what he was teaching was the necessity of unpacking the language, the framing, the context for thinking about technology as we grapple with legal, ethical, and policy implications. That's true, certainly true in this piece, which I really think the elements, Carys references that may have come from Ian are really quintessential Ian, Aristotle and Shakespeare and chess-playing machines and anthropomorphism and David Hasselhoff, all making appearances. And that, I think, is really true for all his scholarship. It's amazing to see not just those kinds of references, but that also included within so much of his scholarship are the references and the engagement with just this amazing array of legal, technological, philosophical, and ethical scholars. You know, for Ian to engage in scholarship was to enter into a conversation with the broader community, and that invariably meant citing, thinking about, and working with the work of others. We so often talk about how great scholarship builds on the work of others. It's one reason why he was so supportive of an open access approach for the journal. And Ian really lived it. The insights that are repeated and that are found in this article are repeated in so many other areas. You'll know that he was a man of many talents who engaged at the intersection of law and technology in a wide range of areas. Early on, that meant thinking about bots and contracts with Bots Babes in the Californication of Commerce piece that looked at automated electronic commerce and what at the time was the emerging use of animated avatars and other electronic entities that built relationships with consumers that he noted often created this illusion of friendship, and he was often able to build that into his presentations in really powerful ways. Later, he became actively engaged in copyright, especially looking at the issues around digital locks. He did work for the government on this issue. He did a couple of contributions for books that I edited, and it was in the digital locks and the automation of virtue piece that he contributed this fantastic chapter. Carys contributed a great chapter as well. So this was one that really brought together some fantastic people. And once again, Ian emphasized language, tracing the concept and construct of locks going all the way back to the Gordian knot, talking about how there were really two features there, that locks were important not only for what they restrict, but also what they permit. And so we talked about things like automated permissions and what that would mean. And of course, what also the restrictions that digital locks would bring, arguing that it would create social and moral costs because suddenly it would undermine the cultivation of a moral virtue with the locks themselves making decisions that people would otherwise make for themselves. And that prodigious scholarship is found in this wide range of areas, whether it was in healthcare, where he wrote with a number of people talking about and emphasizing that technologies that science enables aren't neutral, and that it was not always appropriate to leave science to its own devices. With Katie Salagi on killer robots, where again, talking about the need for all of us to consider and engage with the consequences of a future of lethal autonomous robots and what that might mean for broader societies. And of course, there was just this myriad of privacy pieces, looking at everything from brain privacy to the need to think about AI and robots and their implications for privacy. And for so many of these pieces, it was engaging scholarship, but then it was more than that. It was active policymaking, appearing before government committees and in op-eds and at the UN and in this wide range of spaces where he was just so committed to ensuring that the ideas were part of the discussion, but also expanding beyond the kinds of communities that he was an active part of. And so it is a phenomenal scholarly library. And this article really is, I think, a fitting capstone to it, because it represents really the best of what Ian did, collaborating, thinking ahead, unpacking technology in today's terms, and drawing from really a dizzying array of sources. And perhaps best of all, always doing it with flair, humility, and I think a big dose of fun. We find ourselves still today, and literally right now, on Zoom and team calls. And I think that we could use a whole lot more of that flair and dose of fun about now. And so I'm grateful that Ian's memories and his work live on, and thankful that his work with Carys, and now learning even more about how that work came to be, gave us one more really exceptional piece that undoubtedly will influence thinking on copyright and AI for years to come. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Thank you so much, Michael. I'm going to try to keep it together after those comments. And also because like between this and the English, I will please everybody excuse any mistake I will make in the following moments. If I would invite our guests to ask any question they may have to our panelists in the conversation. I'm going to use my privilege as being like your facilitator to offer maybe some comments, and then I will maybe hand it over back to Carys or like to James if you want to also like reflect on what Michael said, or James what like Carys and Michael said. But so yeah, thank you for the three of you for your time and for your comments, and I can only just agree with everything that you said. And Michael, yes, I remember that meeting with the bank, and actually I discussed with the senior leadership of the bank last week again about that event. And yeah, exactly what we're trying to do with the initiative is exactly this, and to have like people from different discipline discussing together, like to amplify conversation between law, tech, like people in law, people in the computer science, engineering field, people in social sciences, and not like, yeah, we need to talk together. And this is also, I think, what Carys and Ian did in that piece, having like all those different fields in conversation to try to answer and think about the future. And sometimes just at looking at what happened like yesterday, and as you mentioned, like Ian was big on student on junior academics. I'm the new kid. I'm still the new kid at Ottawa, and yeah, it was an amazing amazing mentor, and this is what we're trying to do with the speaker series. I know it was big on just having like white cis male on panels, on like supporting women, on supporting like people with different background in academia. And if you remember, like, so right after he passed away, we had like so many young scholars sharing how like Ian had been instrumental in then like feeling empowered, and I will count myself in this. And yeah, I will invite everybody to go back to his scholarship. And so as part of the book I just mentioned earlier, so I authored with my friend and colleague Marina Pavlovich a piece on AI and contract. And I went back to read again Bud's Babes and the Californication of Commerce that you just mentioned, Michael. And when I was reading that piece, I'm like, okay, what can we add? We should just like reproduce the piece. People should just go back, read what he wrote, like so in 2004 and even before. Just like he was very much like a pioneer. He thought of everything before even it was sexy, even like it was an issue. He knew it was coming. And same with the digital locks. And when you read the write-up about the painting, Katie's is like he added those idea of like he loved to unlock our universe, but also unlock knowledge. And I think this is also another like important part to keep in mind when we discuss AI and copyright. It's not just about authorship, but also access, not using copyright to lock access. That's why he was promoting open access. That's why we're delighted to have the piece in the Ottawa Law Review, and making sure that yes, algorithms, like people have access to set of data to train on better data set the algorithms. Although this is not the only issue with algorithmic design. On that note, maybe I don't know, James, Carys, if you want also to offer some more reflection. And again, I will invite our guests to ask the question that they may have in the conversation.
I just wanted to say what a delight it was to hear Carys and Michael's presentation, because there's such great reminders both of what was wonderful about Ian's scholarship and about Ian. It's impossible to overstate how beloved and welcome he was in the community. That just a face that at a conference would make it better, and other people would light up when they saw him across the room, just for the chance to sit down and enjoy his company. It's endlessly welcoming, endlessly supportive, and just a model of a colleague that we can all aspire to. And in Carys, your remarks, the two words that really sort of jumped out at me as sort of capturing the spirit of the project, and again, a lot of the work that Ian has done were ontology and messy. That the interplay between thinking very hard about how things are and the assumptions we make, and the extraordinary messiness of actual experience. And one of the things that drove me to write about this topic in the first place was people would demand simple answers. Is the computer an author or not? And that question papers over such a wide range of situations encompassed within the question. By computer, by algorithm, by AI, we mean everything from that spirograph up through multi-layer recurrent neural nets with enormously different models, with different ways that people engage with them. I wrote an entire paper just trying to list some of the different ways people could create individually or together with computers. And so to ask, is the computer an author, is to impose one very particular vision about the nature of what the computer itself is on this myriad of different processes. So by just going back and challenging those assumptions and bringing back in the complexity of how we have always related to each other and to works, it puts complexity back in that the copyright doctrinal work always seems to try to squeeze out. And it just everything Ian touched is so much more humane and rich from having that perspective breathed back into it. You lose sight so often of the lives and the experiences behind the legal doctrines, and Ian never let anyone else forget about them.
Yeah, I think that's such a key piece of like what unifies his work across such a broad range of topics over so many years. And I've had the same experience as Florian of beginning to work on a project that seems to me to be cutting edge, and then going back and reading something that Ian had written about it like 10, 15 years ago and being like, oh, yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that. Like, he actually anticipated all these things that at the time didn't even seem particularly pertinent because they hadn't happened and no one had really imagined them yet. And so I know when I started working on a piece on digital locks and fair dealing for Michael's book, I went back to what Ian had written as Tilting at Windmills piece on technological protection measures. And yeah, it was one of those moments. There's like, oh, he absolutely saw and said really important things about what was coming. And at the time, I was like, well, I'm not really interested in that. And I did the same with privacy. I did the same with AI, right? Like I thought, well, it's not really the thing that I'm interested in. And then eventually I get there and I'm like, oh, now I really understand what it was that had captured his imagination. And it turns out that it is exactly what I'm interested in. It just plugs in, and he could see those connections that it took me much longer to kind of stumble upon. So I think in every field, that was very much just the way he worked and the vision that he brought to his work. I don't know if we have, I had a couple of other little points to make. I don't know if I have, yeah, okay, I'm not sure if we have questions pending, but just the other thing I think is, so, part of my resistance was I don't really care much about all this sort of technological gadgetry. Like, I'd rather do like, first principles, big ideas, legal theory stuff. And he's like, what do you think it is that I'm doing? Like, what do you think it is that, that Ryan Cale's doing or Kate Darling's doing? Do you think we care about, technological gadgetry? It's not the technology for the sake of technology, right? And this is what good law and technology scholarship is. It cares about technology because of the lens that it brings to open up and to look under the systems that we currently have in place, like to revisit those sort of normative assumptions that we have made that we maybe thought were universal or transtemporal, but turns out we're very much rooted in whatever our reality was then, and the particular sort of pragmatic positions that we were responding to, and to be able to sort of revisit those, right? So one of the things about this piece that made it so enjoyable for me was that it wasn't really just about how AI works or what emergent creativity is, but it was really an opportunity to say why authorship matters. And so even, you know, when we are engaging with copyright policy in sort of a utilitarian frame, we take for granted that we're trying to encourage authorship. But what we have to do now, when we don't know now whether we need to encourage this or not, is ask the question of why. Right? Why are we trying to encourage authorship? What is it about authorship that we value that fits with our sense of the kinds of relationships we want to foster, the kind of society we want to live in? And this is an opportunity to provoke a re-examination of that question. Right? So I think that that's the sort of the bigger philosophical approach that he brought to any instance of a sort of new technology presenting new policy questions, was to say, where's the starting point? And so like unwork our assumptions and try to get back to the sort of social and human values that are at stake when we think about these new technologies. So one other thing was just maybe in response to Michael on the collaboration. Sorry to go on, but I've collaborated with a few people, not nearly so many, but working with Ian was not really like anything else, in the sense that his like editing function and marginal comments were always just an opportunity to say how brilliant something was, how much he loved it. Yes, keep going. This is amazing. This is fitting together. It was like cheerleading from the marginal comments. And it occurred to me that this, as you were saying, James, is like another moment where you can kind of model what it should mean to collaborate, what it should mean to encourage people to work with them, to try to nurture their ideas as you're producing something together. And that I think is also a model for what we should all be doing when we work with one another. So it was, again, just a joy to be able to do it. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Carys. I'm gonna move for a few seconds to one of the questions in the chat. So one of the attendees is asking, so it's a question to you, Carys, so you're gonna continue to be able to share your thoughts on the paper. Speaking of authorship, could you speak more about the role that post-structuralist theory played in your and Jan's thinking through the composition of your paper?
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. So certainly one of the problematics that we wanted to engage in was the relevance of post-structuralism for thinking about authorship in the context of the copyright debates. But this, again, was not a copyright paper, it was an authorship paper, and so we really had to engage with all the post-structuralist theory and what authorship is. And that's where we see, whenever it is invoked in this context, I think the normal route is to suggest that it leads to the sort of the death of the author, and then to emerge from that moment to sort of refocus on the nature of the text or the work as a product, and to think about the audience or the reader, and to therefore say, you know, what does it matter who is the author? And so what we wanted to do substantively with that was show that what really followed from this post-structuralist theory was not the sort of the death or the dismissal of the concept of the author, but the reimagination of the author in a much richer way that wasn't the author as the source and the controller of the text and meaning, but rather was the author in social context, in conversation, and thinking then about the relationship, the communicative relationship between the author and the reader, or the author as sort of in a chain of communication or dialogue, both responding to and anticipating responses from others, right? So it was like, it brings in this social context and sort of rids us of the idea of the individual author as the source of meaning and the independent creator of text. But I think the question is kind of getting as well at how we compose the paper with this idea in mind. And there were a few moments where we thought, we wanted the paper to feel itself like a dialogue, right? Not just between us, although I think that comes through in part, but also with all of those sources from different contexts that we try to pull in. And so I think we probably make a bit more use of quoting, of referencing other people's works and bringing them in explicitly into dialogue with one another, perhaps, than is maybe normal in at least an academic legal paper. So I think we did that in part. I'm not sure how conscious it was at the time, but at the end, I think Michael Frumkin pointed out to us, he's like, you use a ton of quotes and everybody in your quoting was responding to the other person that you quoted from, and is this deliberate? And Ian was like, of course it's deliberate. And I don't know if it really was or if it's just what happened. But either way, I think the idea that it's that we understand the creation of meaning as being a dialogic process, that it's putting voices into communication with one another that brings about a new way of thinking or a new understanding. And I think we hoped that the paper would reveal this to be so, rather than just saying that it is.
Perfect, thank you. There is another question, and that's kind of like connecting that piece to another article by Ian that he published like a few months before the H and R in for Francophone, very complex, Schrodinger's robots piece. So you see in the death of the AI author, and I could go discuss that title for so long. You see in the piece a meaningful engagement with the idea of relationality, which was also something that Jan discussed in the context of that other paper that was about privacy. So Carys, could you maybe comment a bit more on the legacy of incorporating ideas of relationality in the spirit of feminist scholars like Nedelsky in the technology law space?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Katie, for the question. So this was one of the areas that we had first started talking about together. Ian had called me when he was working on his paper on relationality and privacy to say, what do you mean by relational theory? And let's talk about it some more. And what do you understand Nedelsky to be saying? And so we had that conversation, I think over drinks at some point, and had kind of fleshed out what we understood to be the sort of benefit of taking a relational approach to asking these questions in the first instance. And I think watering it down, like the ideas that we begin by thinking about and recognizing that both the rights that we create through law and the technologies that we use, that these things construct relationships between people. And therefore, a sort of normative starting point or a policymaking starting point should be inquiring into those relationships, both the nature of those relationships and then how we could construct law or policy or technology differently to kind of foster the relationships that we would want to foster to advance the social values that we hold true. That kind of big picture reasoning that starts with the idea not of the individual rights bearer, but the individual in relation to others. And so when we started working on this piece, we came back to that, and we started off by sort of exchanging, okay, if I'm going to read 3 things to understand where you're coming, you give me your reading list and I'll give you my reading list. So one of the things on my reading list was, of course, his piece on Schrodinger's robot piece. I forget exactly what it was called. And he was like, are we talking about the same thing? Can we do something with relational theory that is consistent across these papers? And so it might seem, I think, on its face that there's something slightly different being said, right? Because in the privacy space, and maybe Michael can help me here, but in the privacy space, I think he really wanted to insist that we have to understand the relationship that people have with AI, with bots, with technology, that means that they can disclose, that there can be an infringement or violation of privacy in those communicative relationships, even although it's not with a person, that we shouldn't assume because it's not with a person that privacy isn't implicated. And so whether this sits with saying, but those relational dialogues are not authorial, or they're not dialogic in the same way when we're thinking about authorship, was like a question we had to navigate. Now, at the end of his piece on privacy, I think he finishes by saying we need to develop a relational understanding of how we relate to technology, to AI, in a sort of in networks of relations. And we need to be much more cognizant of how those operate in order to make good policy. And I think that actually is what he carried on into this paper. Like, there is a relationship. There's no doubt that we receive information, that we impart information that is processed. And so we do need to think about this in relational terms, but we actually have to grapple with what is the nature of that relationship. And I think where he landed here is it's not a dialogic one. It's not the kind of communicative relationship that we care about when we're asking or thinking about authorship. It might be the kind of information sharing relationship that we care about when we think about privacy, but that's a different policy question.
Awesome, thank you. You know, everything is back to like policy, as you said. I think it was you, Carys, in your comments. Like, yeah, for sure, we could by law decide that AI can own copyrights, AI can be an author, but do we want this? Maybe not. Another question, and I think that's important because we discussed some of the theoretical underpinning of the paper and of his scholarship, but also something that Jan was big on. And I think like the three of you mentioned this before, was always the reference to like kind of maybe real life, popular culture, and try to connect with what was happening like around us or in history. So so one of the questions is in the chat is, so yeah, maybe could you like discuss on that deep engagement with like pop culture, with like the HuffBot, and all this piece transverse like legal scholarship to step into the world we all experience for like arts, entertainment, human communication. And maybe I would love to also hear like James and Michael thought about this after. Thank you.
Oh, did you want me to start? Sorry.
Yeah, well, or James or Michael, but like as the co-author, I would say like you first.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, when I was talking about the HuffBot piece, I mean, it was funny because he'd sort of flagged this as like, we're jumping to the HuffBot from talking about whether it's Nietzsche or Foucault, and so these are the this is, I think, one of the most sort of illustrative moments where you hear Ian's voice come through. But what happened with that piece is he'd sort of written it up and he thought it was really an interesting sort of tidbit for how people interact with, or how people understand their relationships with AI, right? And so this concern about our tendency to anthropomorphize AI, to humanize AI is, it's well documented, and it's a really important piece of this. And we can come at this from different levels, recognizing that that's what we tend to do. Also in itself is an important sort of signpost for policy making and policy development, right? Once we know that humans have a sort of natural tendency and inclination to humanize and anthropomorphize, then that tells us something about where we need to be careful in creating laws to protect us from that tendency, right? So anyone that was watching 60 Minutes yesterday and chuckling as the robots danced hasn't maybe spent the same amount of time worrying about what it means for us to imagine that robots are dancing when they're not dancing. They're representing physically what dance is, but it's a different thing from understanding that they're actually doing the mashed potato and enjoying dancing to this music together, right? And so is there a danger in our confusion about the sort of aesthetics and the expressive agency of the AI as sort of the starting point? But as he worked with it, and certainly as we passed the draft backwards and forwards, we both had landed sort of independently in the idea that there's something different between humanizing and romanticizing. And it's really that next step that the words of Hasselhoff sort of explicate, which is the way in which the notion that the AI just knows him naturally, like has sort of this amazing insight into his soul, and is therefore able to write a script that's perfect for him, is to discard again all of the inputs that were actually fed to the AI, like all of the lines that had been delivered in all of the past movies. And so it was a wonderful example, I think, of what happens when we empty out the inputs and we forget the connections and the origins of the AI outputs. And then we're able not just to sort of humanize the AI and imagine a relationship with them, but that we imagine that AI, we sort of venerate them as this sort of romantic author with this creative capacity beyond what we could imagine. So that was fun.
Yeah, and one of the things that I love about that example is precisely that de-romanticizing tendency, and that it makes vivid the de-romanticization extends much further than just the Hoffbot. That, you know, Hasselhoff feels like this robot knows him and sees into his soul, and it's in some ways very easy to recognize in this example that maybe the robot is doing no such thing, and that maybe the human authors who also he might feel have written dialogue that sees into his soul are also doing no such thing. And the human authors too, the script writers and others who are part of this, are part of a cultural milieu and have drawn on a variety of sources and upon their experience and relationship to him to craft lines. And that to situate the creativity purely in them, as the romantic author theory does, is to miss all the other influences. And so the piece is in some ways an application of criticism of romantic authorship and reading of literary theory into discussions about the nature of AI creativity. But by grounding it in such vivid examples, it also helps explicate that theory in the first place by mapping back some of these ideas from the realm in which the humanization is clearly fallacious, to help better understand the broader critique of human creativity in the first place. And that Ian's delight in examples is always about this. They're grounded in something that's accessible, and thereby helps make vivid the claims that otherwise might seem abstract and harder to grasp. It's an integral part of his writing style.
Yeah.
It is. If I could just add, I mean, one of the things that always amazed me about Ian is he was someone who was, for the longest time, proud to say that he didn't have a cell phone. They didn't spend a lot of time on Twitter or on social media or any of those sorts of the kind of sources that you would often look to kind of be able to incorporate precisely this kind of popular culture. And his ability to know stuff that most time I never had heard of any of these examples, and they were often so compelling, and so he was so plugged in, speaks to how you can build community without the need for the kind of technology that a lot of us rely upon today to be able to do that. I mean, he did it in many ways the old-fashioned way, through his students and through his broader scholarly community and others. And it was there that he was, engaging and working with others. I see Jason saying that it was the army of students working with him, and I don't doubt it. But I mean, that's just such a wonderful throwback approach in some ways for so many others who are so reliant today on technology to know what's happening at sort of that cutting edge of culture. And the fact that he was able to do this for so long by saying, I can do it in a much more humane and human way, is part of what I think really made him great.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michael. And yeah, I agree with what you just said. It's also because he was creating, a community, a safe space for the student to share the most crisis idea or anecdote, what happened in their life on social media, that he was able maybe to draw those kind of conclusions. And speaking of conclusion, I see that the time is running. It's almost already 1 p.m. So I think we should close there. But I would like to thank the three of you again for sharing your thoughts and yeah, and celebrating Ian, and as you said, Michael, yeah, creating community and like empowering the next generation, the junior scholar. And during one of Carys' comments earlier was like my job talk and like my interviews came back to my memory, and it was on my committee, and we're discussing my PhD. It was like, that's great, those amazing things like about the serious law, but what do you want to do like for real? Do you have something exciting? And so I started to discuss my ideas about like algorithms and like Bitcoin, blockchain. Like, I know it's a bit crazy. It's not like the real things that I should be doing. And it was like, no. It got excited, I think, in my profile at that moment. I was like, no, this is what you need to do. Go for it. No, it's what you mentioned earlier, like Carys, like for him, everything matters, and like the most insignificant technology or thing that might be just a buzzword, you could like go look beyond the buzzwords. Something that most people should do for blockchain and Bitcoin, by the way, PSA, to look at like the implication for society and how like also as lawyers, as law professors, like we need to look like on behalf of the public interest, for society to develop those kind of policy framework to make sure that we can protect the digital rights of Canadians and people around the world. But as Michael mentioned, like he was Canadian, he was proud to be a Canadian, sometimes to say a bit of French. Yeah, so on those words, I think we're gonna end our event here for today. Thank you again to the three of you for your for like taking the time and sharing your thoughts. Thank you for everybody who joined us today on the call, and we will post everything online. And yeah, and I invite you. As always, we continue to hosting events during this pandemic, and the next one would be actually in 2 days on a Wednesday on AI and health in French with the support of the French Embassy in Canada. So the Dialogue France-Canada en IA sur les questions de politique numérique et de santé. So on those words, thank you again. Have all a lovely remaining of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
And thank you again, Carys, James, and Michael. That was a delight.
It was fun.